Welcome back. We will begin this video by talking about 3.4, the decline of kaidan film adaptations. Although Studio Toho had still released its movie Kaidan to critical acclaim in the mid-1960s, the end of the 1960s actually saw a considerable decline in the general popularity of kaidan film adaptations. Studio Dai tried their luck with more classical kaidan films around this time, with various works like Botan Doro from 1968, another film version of the Peony Lantern ghost story, Kaidan Yukijoro from 1968, a film version of the Yuki Onna or Snow Woman tale that was also featured in Toho's Kaidan, Yotsuya Kaidan Oiwa no Bore from 1969, yet another film version of Yotsuya Kaidan. This title translates to Ghost Story of Yotsuya, Oiwa's Ghost, Hiroku Kaibyoden from 1969. The title roughly translates to Secret Records, Legend of the Monster Cat, or Kaidan Kasane ga Fuchi from 1970. But all these new movies from Studio Dai didn't attract as many moviegoers anymore as expected. The enthusiasm for the genre seemed to finally wear off, and one of the causes for this is thought to have been the ever-growing influence of Western horror films on Japanese horror cinema. This influence of Western films could already be felt in earlier decades in works like Toho's Henshin Ningen Shirizu, the Human Metamorphosis series from 1957 until 1960, and it continued to grow with more horror directors taking their inspiration from Western horror cinema, such as for instance director Sato Hajime, whose films veered away from traditional Japanese kaidan movies and were a lot more comparable to Western horror cinema of the time. As a concrete example, his work Kyuketsuki Gokimidoro from 1968 could be named. A literal translation of the title would be Bloodsucker Gokimidoro. The English release title was Goke Body Snatcher from Hell. One of the most significant Western influences in this regard was the British film production company Hammer Film Productions, which became particularly well known for its Dracula and Frankenstein horror films. However, before we take a closer look at some of the developments that were born from this Western influence, let us actually return to Studio Dai once more, because besides the more traditional kaidan films that Studio Dai produced towards the end of the 1960s, they also produced a much more modern kaidan film that highlights a different noteworthy development. I'm talking about the movie Kaidan no Toshiana from 1968, directed by Shima Koji, which is a great example of a horror film that takes traditional motifs and places them into a modern, contemporary setting. First, a quick summary. The film takes place during a period of economic growth in post-World War II Japan. The plot revolves around the ruthless character Kuramoto Haruo, who is an employee of a large trading company. Kuramoto grew up in poverty and is now driven by an unhealthy desire to rise to the top, so as to triumph over all those who once made fun of him. He is secretly engaged to a certain Nishino Etsuko, who works as a typist at the same company. But there is a dark side to their relationship, as Kuramoto uses Etsuko to close lucrative deals with his trade partners by forcing her to offer her body to them. Kuramoto's constant successes eventually cause the company president to place full trust in him. What's more, the company president even suggests that Kuramoto should marry his daughter Midori. Kuramoto realizes that marrying the company president's daughter would secure him a place at the top of the company, and so he gives in to the temptation. But when Etsuko learns that Kuramoto wants to throw her away so as to rise even further to the top, she is furious and threatens to tell the company president of Kuramoto's current relationship with her and to reveal how Kuramoto made her sell her body so he could achieve his successes. On top of that, Kuramoto also learns that she is pregnant with his child. Realizing that all of this would mean the end of his ambitions, Kuramoto decides to simply murder Etsuko and hide her body in a pipe shaft of the office building. Thereafter, his wedding with the company president's daughter proceeds as planned and they go on a luxurious honeymoon. However, as he returns to the office, he learns of some recent uncanny occurrences. He is told that eerie typing noises can be heard at night from Etsuko's former department, even though no one should be there at that time of night. Furthermore, every typist who sits at Etsuko's former desk ends up sick. Etsuko, whose murder hasn't been discovered yet, is officially considered missing, but rumor spreads that she must be dead and must have turned into a vengeful spirit, an onryo. At first, Kuramoto tries to laugh off the idea, but it seems to nag at him, and so one night he visits the office, only to hear the uncanny typing noises himself and to finally encounter Etsuko's vengeful spirit. She haunts him and his mental health begins to deteriorate from then on, until he is eventually killed by Etsuko's brother, who has been investigating her disappearance. End of the summary. Now, maybe you've already noticed the parallels yourself, but in a way it's possible to look at the entire movie as a modernized reimagination of the Yotsuya Kaidan plot, especially when compared to later modified versions of the plot like the one that was portrayed in Nakagawa Nobuo's film Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan from 1959, in which Oiwa's husband Iemon himself is a co-conspirator in the plan to poison his wife just so he can marry Oume in order to gain a higher social standing. Similar to this, Kaidan Toshiana's Kuramoto Haruo decided to murder his fiancée so that he could marry the company president's daughter Midori to gain a higher social standing. Overall, I think the movie Kaidan no Toshiana is a great example of how traditional patterns from Japanese horror fiction, such as that of female vengeful spirits, eventually became detached from their classical background and were combined with more modern settings instead. As a quick side note, I'm not saying that Kaidan no Toshiana was necessarily the first Japanese movie to do this, but at the very least it was the first one I could find. And even if it wasn't the first one, it still is a good example of Japanese horror movies implementing traditional motifs in new settings. Chapter 3.5 Splatter and Slasher Movies. Despite films like Kaidan no Toshiana, overall Japanese horror cinema of the 1970s and 1980s began to turn away from classical motifs for the time being. Less and less classical Kaidan film adaptations were being produced, and instead, Japanese cinema leaned increasingly towards Western horror movies. As such, the international success of the movie The Exorcist from 1973, directed by William Friedkin, also didn't go unnoticed in Japan and even sparked a new general interest in psychic phenomena and occultism, which could perhaps be seen as a revival of the parapsychological boom that had happened in Japan with the introduction of the Ouija board-like game Kokori-san around 1884. See video 2.5. Furthermore, the 1980s in Japan saw the creation of what is called OV, which stands for Original Video, called Originaru Video in Japanese. These OVs were direct-to-video productions, which means they were films that were not produced for cinema or television, but were sold directly on videotapes instead. To give you some background, in 1976, the Japanese company JVC had released their Video Home System format, or VHS format, a format for videotape recording, which opened up many new options to consumers. On top of that, Japanese television had become quite popular during the 1980s, and all this had made it riskier for film studios to churn out big-budget projects, since people could also just watch TV or videotapes now instead of going to the cinema. On the other hand, these aforementioned direct-to-video releases, these OVs, were a lot cheaper and less risky to produce. They also were a lot less censored, and therefore you could find quite gruesome horror content among them. One example is the gore movie series Guinea Pig, which began in 1985. The second installment in this series, Guinea Pig 2 Chiniku no Hana from 1985, the title translates to Guinea Pig 2 Flower of Flesh and Blood, contained such extreme depictions of violence that actor Charlie Sheen thought it to be a real snuff film and contacted the FBI. The series also came under fire in 1989 when one of its releases, called The Guinea Pig Manhoru no Naka no Ningyo, this could be translated as The Guinea Pig, the Mermaid in the Manhole, was discovered in the home of serial killer Miyazaki Tsutomu. After the serial killer's apprehension, the media began to blame horror films and anime for his horrific deeds, which actually caused a temporary decline of interest in horror movies, although not for long. Such increasingly gore-heavy works in Japanese horror cinema from the 1980s had most likely been influenced by the growing success of Western slasher films and splatter films. These genres had gained particular traction in the 1970s and 1980s with American works such as Halloween from 1978, Dawn of the Dead from 1978 as well, Friday the 13th from 1980, or A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. And this influence was not limited to the realm of OVs. There were also actual theatrically released slasher or splatter films in Japan, such as the slasher film Shirio no Wana from 1988, the English release was called Evil Dead Trap, in which a TV show host and her crew investigate an abandoned factory only to be brutally murdered one by one. But back to OVs once more. One of the film studios that were active in the OV business was Studio Nikkatsu. As mentioned in previous videos, Nikkatsu was one of the oldest Japanese film studios and once a very major studio. You may even remember their name from video 3.2, where I listed some of the very first classical kaidan film adaptations that had been produced by Studio Yokota Shokai and Studio Yoshizawa Shoten, both of which merged with other studios into Studio Nikkatsu in 1912. Well, now in the 1980s, things were a bit different, as Studio Nikkatsu had been hit hard by the success of television and had eventually shifted their focus onto adult films. In 1985, however, they released an OV that mixed erotic content with horror elements, resulting in a grotesque erotic horror OV movie called Hako no Naka no Onna Shoujo Ikengie, translation The Woman in the Box, The Virgin Sacrifice, followed in 1986 by an erotic splatter film called Shoujo no Harawata, which translates to Guts of a Virgin, essentially proving once more that OVs were a much less censored realm in which you could find really weird horror movies at this time. Then, in 1989, film studio Toei established their own OV series and called it V-Cinema, or V-Cinema in Japanese. This is probably where I should mention that nowadays the terms OV and V-Cinema are often used interchangeably to both refer to this sort of direct-to-video film, but originally V-Cinema was the name of Studio Toei's OV series. At first, Studio Toei released V-Cinema films that covered the topics Yakuza, erotica, and gambling, but 2 years later, in 1991, they published something very important. A series called Honto ni atta kowai hanashi, which translates to Scary Stories That Actually Happened. And this series was very different from the previously mentioned gore-heavy works. It felt like a return to classical Japanese motifs and made use of a much more subtle and eerie style. Its title comes from the fact that this series claimed to present reenactments of true ghost stories in the form of short films. Honto ni atta kowai hanashi eventually became so successful that it actually spawned proper TV shows, theatrically released movies, and so on. What's more, works from this Honto ni atta kowai hanashi franchise are still being produced to this day, and Toei's direct-to-video V-Cinema version is of particular interest here as it contains some highly influential episodes that would go on to inspire various upcoming Japanese horror film directors, and can even be seen as the forerunner of what would eventually turn into what people nowadays call J-horror. But that is a topic for the next video, in which we will talk in more detail about this impactful series. But wait, before we end this video, since I brought up the term J-horror just now, would you be able to define it? I would wager that many of you have heard the term before, but the thing is, it's actually quite difficult to find something like an official definition of it. So allow me to briefly explain how I want to use it in these videos. To the best of my knowledge, the term J-horror became popular when films like Ringu, Ju-on, and their Western or Western-oriented remakes like The Ring and The Grudge gained traction. These films became known for their focus on ghosts, curses, and for using a lot of atmosphere and tension. And so, many people use the term J-horror to refer to Japanese films, but also books or video games that fit these criteria and are in one or more ways comparable to the style of Ringu, Ju-on, etc. I also found an interesting and, in my opinion, quite fitting definition on the free dictionary website Wiktionary, where it is written that J-horror is Japanese horror fiction in film, video games, and other popular culture, typically marked by psychological tension and supernatural elements. Well, I think those are pretty good definitions to work with, so whenever I use the term J-horror in this video series from here on, that is how I would like it to be understood. And with that out of the way, we're fully prepared to dive into the deeply influential Honto ni atta kowai hanashi and the beginnings of J-horror in the next video. I hope to see you there, and as always, take care and goodbye.